Welcome everyone to Rising Seas and Climate Change with Dr Asha de Vos, a One World Festival event organised by CADA and Ulster University School of Geography and Environmental Science. The One World Festival is running until the 15th of October, with more events on the environment as well as issues which have a global impact. So visit oneworldfestivalni.com for all the details and to get involved. Today, we'll be hearing about the impact of climate change on the environment, oceans, and the communities whose lives depend on them around the world. Global warming is causing rising temperatures and accelerated melting of glaciers, resulting in an increase in the volume of the oceans. Up to 410 million people are at risk of displacement due to rising sea levels, and along with more frequent severe storms, the likelihood of flooding in coastal communities is increasing. The impact of this rise will be most strongly felt in areas of greater need and in the developing world, even though global warming is disproportionately caused by the global north. I am absolutely delighted to welcome Dr Asha de Vos, our keynote speaker. Asha is a marine biologist, ocean educator, senior TED Fellow, and was chosen for a BBC 100 Women Award in 2018, amongst many other accolades and achievements. She was born in Sri Lanka, has carved out her career in a male-dominated field, and is considered by National Geographic as a pioneer of blue whale research. Today, Asha is going to talk to us about her research on whale poo, the impact of climate change on the oceans, and how we need nature more than it needs us.
Hi everybody, my name is Dr. Asha de Vos, and I'm incredibly excited to be with all of you at the One World Festival today. While it's not ideal that I can't be there amongst you sharing these stories live, I am so grateful to have been invited to participate at least virtually. And hopefully by the end of this, I will leave you inspired and more in love with the oceans and whales than you ever thought was possible. Today I want to talk about why I think whales are our ocean superheroes. There's two reasons for me. The first one is personal, as you'll see from the first part of my talk. They're such an important part of my own journey and story. And the second reason is because I think they're such an integral part in our fight against climate change. So to get this story off the ground, I need you all to come with me, teleport from where you are all the way to Sri Lanka, and then go back in time to 2003. Back in 2003, I was just starting my career, and I was working on a whale research vessel that had been circumnavigating the globe. It had stopped in Sri Lanka, and I managed to wangle my way on board. And we were doing research on sperm whales. In fact, what we were doing was we were dropping these underwater microphones called hydrophones into the water, eavesdropping on sperm whales, and then basically trying to track them down. When we found them, we take these tiny biopsy samples from them that could tell us about the toxicology of the ocean environment. Because these expeditions are pretty expensive, we always try to make sure we're collecting as much data as possible. So not just the acoustics, but we also always have someone on board, on deck, looking up for signs of life. On this particular day of interest, I was that person. I was standing up on deck, staring out at this beautiful flat calm water. As you can see, there's not a ripple on the surface, not a drop of wind. It was such a beautiful day, but sweltering hot. I was looking out for the sperm whales that I knew were out there because I could hear these recordings that were being played on loudspeaker in the pilot house of the ship. The cacophony meant that they were right around us, but they were eluding us. But I knew what I was looking for. A short, bushy blow slanted off onto the left-hand side, because sperm whales are toothed whales and have one blowhole or nostril, and it is placed on the left-hand sides of their heads. It makes them pretty easily recognizable when we're out at sea. I was standing there staring. My shift was coming to an end. I was getting frustrated because I wanted to be the person to see these whales. And I was almost at the end of my shift when I saw this. A tall, powerful, vertical blow that rose all the way to the sky as far as I could tell. I immediately knew it could only come from an animal that was gigantic. I got super excited. I grabbed the walkie-talkie that was dangling in front of me, called out to my captain, and I said, Bob, 11 o'clock, 2 kilometers now. We have to move. And he very calmly responds and says, why? And I say, I think it's a blue whale. And he says, okay. And he then turns the ship in the direction I've asked him to go, and we start moving. I start to panic because at this point, I'm not a scientist. I'm just a deckhand. All I'm doing on this ship right now is cleaning toilets and polishing brass. And here, the captain had just shifted the general direction of this expedition based on my potential sighting of a blue whale. I was panicking, as you can only imagine. I was so afraid to lose sight of this animal. I was staring unblinkingly into the sun and the wind. There were tears streaming down my cheeks. And that's when I started to think I was losing my mind. There wasn't one blue whale, but there were 6 blue whales in an area the size of a football pitch. Okay, immediately I thought to myself, what? This is the largest animal that's ever roamed our planet. They have 70% of our planet to travel, but they're choosing to aggregate in this small area in warm tropical waters. So I thought, okay, what are they doing? And I was fresh out of undergrad, so I had the answers, obviously. I reflected back on what my textbooks and my professors had said, and they said large whales, like blue whales, undertook long-range migrations between cold feeding areas and warm breeding and calving areas. I thought, wow, that's it. I'm going to be the first person to ever see blue whales mating and having babies. Got really excited. I'm urging the captain to move forward. I'm watching these whales. I'm standing right at the front of the boat, almost falling off the front because I really wanted to be the first person to witness this event, something no one had ever seen before. And as we get closer and closer and closer, I realize it's not quite what I expected to see. The whales were definitely not mating, and there were no calves or babies anywhere in sight. Instead, there were 6 blue whales, which I will say is a fantastically magical sight, but they were just kind of hanging out. One would dive, come up, the next one would kind of dive, maybe come up. They weren't really doing very much. I was really confused. But at this point, I thought, okay, now we've made this journey. So I turned to Bob, my captain, and I said, hey, Bob, do you mind if we just stick around for a little longer? And he says, sure. And I'm so glad we did, because that's when I saw this. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a pile of blue whale poop. That's right, I'm going to give you all a second to marvel at how beautiful it is. It's by far the most beautiful poop in the animal kingdom. And if you want to challenge me, you have to send me evidence. But what was more interesting to me at that moment, from a scientific point of view, was that if these animals were pooping, that meant they were feeding somewhere close in these waters around my country. But remember what I told you earlier, large whales like blue whales undertake long-range migrations between cold feeding areas and warm breeding and calving areas. But Sri Lanka is just 5 degrees above the equator, as warm and as tropical as you can imagine. Yet somehow these animals seem to be feeding here. This was unbelievable. And what I can tell you is, this is also my eureka moment. Because at that moment, I realized that these animals were doing something really different. They'd figured out how they'd adapted to feeding in warm tropical waters, which had never been heard of, and nobody thought was possible before this. I was so stoked. In the intervening years, I've gone on to show that this population is the only non-migratory blue whale population in the world, and they tend to live in warm tropical waters throughout their lives. As you can see from this map, they tend to use a very small portion of the ocean. I want to highlight that there are multiple populations of blue whales across the world, and this particular population seems to like the warm tropical waters, extending their range to the Arabian Sea, down to maybe the Maldive Islands, and off to the east coast of Sri Lanka. So it's quite limited for an animal that potentially you'd think could travel really far. But obviously, it finds everything it needs in this area and therefore doesn't have to get beyond these borders or these undrawn borders. These blue whales tend to lift their tail flukes up, like in this photograph, more often than anywhere else in the world. They do it about 60% of the time, whereas in other populations, they'll do it maybe about 20% of the time. And what I've found is that this could be related to the fact that they're not feeding on krill, like blue whale populations across the world, but they're feeding on a kind of suggested shrimp that actually is deeper in the water column. And so to get down to those depths, they have to streamline their bodies, torpedo themselves all the way down. So they do this by basically gracefully lifting up their tails and descending to the depths. These animals also have a unique vocal dialect. It's all very interesting and tells us that this is a unique population that has adapted to these waters, but also potentially, therefore, has very different needs to blue whale populations anywhere else in the world. Luckily, none of the countries surrounding these blue whales, their range, have ever indulged in whaling. But in the 60s, there was illegal Soviet whaling. And by this, I mean that there were Soviet whalers that were going en route. They were going to Antarctica to hunt blue whales. And en route, they would stop off in these waters where they knew that there were blue whales, and they would hunt them. Over a very short period, 4 seasons, which amounts to about 60 days in total over 4 years, they took out 1,294 blue whales from this very restricted, limited area. Now, while we don't know how many blue whales are left, we're still trying to figure that out. What I can tell you is taking out such a big number will invariably make a dent in the population and have an impact. And these are all the things I'm trying to understand. So while whaling isn't an issue, like I highlighted today, there are other problems in our oceans. And just briefly, 2 things that I'm trying to look at and address. One is harassment from the whale watching industry. So there's a whale watching industry that has grown and that is focused on basically these blue whales. But they're not always careful around these animals. And so I'm really interested in trying to understand how to make this industry more sustainable in order to protect these blue whales, but also to ensure that I'm protecting the livelihoods of the people that depend on these populations. And that's really important to me. And while the harassment doesn't necessarily lead to death, we don't know what the long-term repercussions of harassment can be, because whale watching across the world is quite a new industry. The other thing is this. It's a much more tragic thing to see. It is what we call ship strike, where large container ships will basically ram into ships. And as you can see in this, this is a whale that came strapped on the bow of a container ship into the main harbor in Sri Lanka, Colombo, back in 2012. We know it died on impact because it showed signs of internal hemorrhaging. 12 days later, we found another carcass that had a massive propeller gash, indicating that this is not an uncommon thing. However, we don't always have evidence because these carcasses very often will sink to the depths of our oceans. So we don't have an exact number of how often it happens. But if we look at studies done in, say, California, where this is a problem for blue whales also there, we know that for every 1 animal that's documented dead by ship strike, there's at least 10 that go undocumented. So it is a significant issue for blue whales in our waters, but also whales in general across the world. So these are 2 problems that I'm trying to resolve and I've been working on for a long time. I've been talking about it for a long time. I've dedicated a lot of my years to this. And a lot of people turn around and then they go, oh, well, you only worry about these whales because they're beautiful and charismatic. And I think to myself, no way. To tell me that the only reason to protect a species is because they're beautiful and charismatic is like telling me that someone is pretty or handsome but has nothing else, no other attributes. These animals are actually incredibly invaluable to us, and they are what we call ecosystem engineers. Ecosystem engineers are basically, as you know, all species, everything in our planet is here for a reason. Everything's interconnected. But ecosystem engineers play a disproportionately larger role in their environment. Their presence or absence really does determine whether the ecosystem functions properly. So let me explain to you how blue whales are, or whales in general, are ecosystem engineers and a vital part of our ocean ecosystem. The first thing to keep in mind is their poop. Okay, so let's break it down. Whales tend to dive to the depths to feed. And as they do so, they feed in areas where there are limiting nutrients that are limited from the surface waters, like iron, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So they feed at these depths and then they come up to the surface to breathe, as they do because they're marine mammals. And as they do so, they release these gigantic fecal plumes. These gigantic fecal plumes now are chock full of those nutrients, the iron, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and therefore the whale's poop is like the ocean's fertilizer. As you can see in this picture, this is a pod of sperm whales that had fed at depth and then now come up to the surface to breathe, and as they've done so, they've released this fecal plume or this poop. That's what the brown stuff is. It's so chock full of good stuff. And then there's these tiny microscopic plants called phytoplankton that float on the surface of our oceans. And they will use carbon dioxide, water, these nutrients, and sunlight to produce oxygen. So a fun fact for all of you, if you didn't know it, is that 50 to 70% of the oxygen that we breathe is actually generated by plants in the ocean. So basically, one in every 2 breaths that we take is generated by plants in the ocean. That's pretty remarkable and a really good reason to think that whales are amazing. But apart from that, this process, which we call the whale pump, is also really important for helping us combat climate change. So how does that happen? Well, here's the thing, right? So the phytoplankton are using carbon dioxide from the environment and producing oxygen in this process called photosynthesis. Therefore, the more phytoplankton there is and the more it's fertilized, the more of that carbon dioxide it's using up and turning into oxygen. Great, that means there's more oxygen in the environment. But apart from that, that means there's also more carbon dioxide being absorbed from the atmosphere. And when these phytoplankton die, they sink to the depths of our oceans and they trap that extra carbon by taking it down to what we call the carbon sink. The ocean is our greatest carbon sink. It's basically an area that holds extra carbon and it's trapped basically at the bottom of our oceans. So this is a really vital process that is obviously very useful for us in a planet that is warming unnecessarily and faster than we need it to. The other way in which whales are important in helping us to combat climate change is in their death through their carcasses. So, okay, you think about it, right? These carcasses are obviously very important because as soon as the whale dies, they're this amazing food source for a number of species at the surface. You can see in this photograph the seabirds and the sharks going for it and getting a good meal, right? But gradually, these carcasses will start to sink to the depths of our oceans. Whale carcasses are the largest form of detritus to sink from the surface of the oceans to the depths. And they provide a food source to about 400 different species, including this slimy, weird-looking hagfish that lies at the bottom. But here's the deal, right? These species, in their lifetime, accumulate carbon within their bodies. The longer an animal lives, the more time it has to accumulate carbon in its body. Whales can live pretty long, some species living even up to 200 years. And the longer you live, the more carbon you accumulate. And when you die, that carbon then, that carcass will sink and take that carbon once again to the depths of our oceans, trapping it and therefore buffering us from some of the worst effects of climate change. This is what a whale fall looks like when it actually rests on the depths of our ocean floor. And there are also a lot of other services it provides. For example, it provides a feast to a number of different species. As you can see in this photograph, this has become an octopus garden. There's octopuses scavenging around. But there's lots of other species, and my favorite is the ossidax worm, or the zombie bone worm as they're called, which I think is awesome. And the zombie bone worm, basically what it does is there are these larvae of ossidax floating through the water column, and then when they find they settle on a whalebone, for example, what happens is the larvae that settles on the whalebone will turn into a female. It'll then bore a hole into the bone and suck out the lipids, and that's the nutrients that it needs to survive. So where are the males? Well, any larvae that falls or lands on a female turns into a male, which is pretty cool, right? But here's the thing, right? In the end, what really matters is that these animals, these whales, the giants of our oceans, the largest animals that have ever lived on our planet, are more than just pretty faces. I think it's time that we all thought about how we protect these animals, not just for their sake, but also for ours. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Asha for such a thought-provoking talk there, and for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today. We really appreciate it. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker from Ulster University, Dr Melanie Biosk, to talk about coasts at risk, monitor, understand, manage and protect. Melanie is a coastal scientist based at Ulster University whose research is focused on monitoring coastal processes in the context of climate change. Following Melanie will be Dr Ryan McGeady, a marine scientist in Ulster University, for his talk on Under the Sea, mapping and monitoring the seabed.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Melanie Biosk from the Ulster University, and tonight I'm going to give you a small talk about coast at risk, how to monitor, understand, and manage and protect our coastlines. So, first of all, what are coasts? They are very attractive environments. More than 60% of the population worldwide lives on the coast. Here you have an example of the city of Sydney, which is clearly built on the coast and on the shore. So they have attractive lifestyles. They attract a lot of tourism, which makes them very important economic hotspots. To define the coast and how to protect them, we need to understand that there are very different types of coasts. Here are examples that have been taken in the UK, though you can see cliffs, pebble beach, sandy beaches, inlets. But worldwide, we have a multitude of different types of coasts that are threatened by different processes. When we talk about coastal problematics and coastal erosion, we usually talk about shoreline, and I'm pretty sure you already heard about the expression shoreline retreat. But what is the shoreline? And here with the sketch from Boketana that has been published in 2005, you can see that it's not an easy answer. Different parameters can be taken into account while defining the shoreline. It can be the dune foot, it can be the limit of the vegetation, it can be the limit between the wet and dry sand. Here is an example of a publication, a recent publication by Grotoli et al. They show that they used the vegetation line because it was an obvious line that was easy to follow the evolution of the coastline. But if he had chosen another parameter, the conclusion about the shoreline retreat and the coastal erosion would have been a bit different. But why studying coastal areas? Like I said, there are threatened environments. The main threats that we hear more and more about is the coastal erosion. Here are some examples of recent newspaper. It's not unusual now to read about houses falling from cliffs or villages disappearing into the sea because of the erosion. Here are other examples. We can see that with one big storm event, what the important erosion can be and how threatened it is, not only for the environment, for the population. You can see all of those houses here, very close, getting very close to the cliff and being threatened by the erosion. Another threatened coastal parameter is the overwash. So the overwash is when, like here, the waves and the water is going inland, passing all the coastal managements. Here is, for example, sediment deposition you can see after the overwash. But another problem linked to the overwash is the coastal flooding and all the consequences and the disaster that comes with it. I'm going to give you here a very small example of the winter 2013-2014. This winter was a succession of very extreme and energetic events. And it was a complete disaster because nobody was prepared to react to that kind of event. And you can see here the erosion of the entire coast and buildings threatened. Those are examples in France, but it was the same thing if we look at the Wales, England, North Cornwall, etc. And the problem was we realized that there was a huge problem in our knowledge at that moment, because those damages we observed after one single winter were damages that were predicted by the models that we had at that time for the next 100 years. So we realized that we had a gap in the knowledge that needed to be more investigated to understand what really happens on the coast and what are the coastal processes linked to those morphodynamic changes. And in this very complex context we're living in, threatened by sea level rise and climate change, those coasts that are really at risk will be even more threatened in the future due to extreme sea levels. If you look at this map, even more coasts will be at risk. And the problem is not only for people living by the coast, it's also the disappearing and the threat of all ecosystems, coastal ecosystems. And if you look just at this map, more and more ecosystems are into threat and will be disappearing. So how to study the coastline? The first thing when we are talking about coastline to think of is the time scale. So there are different time scales. I'm not going to go into too much details, but different time scales means different hydrodynamics, which are going to modify the morphology. And if we look at the coastal morphology and the shoreline morphodynamics, we are talking about mid to long-term events, but also the impact of storms events. So to study the coastline and to monitor the coastline, first of all, what we are doing are morphological surveys, and depending on the timescale you're going to study, you're going to use different methodology. And the first one that we're using currently is the GGPS surveys that lead to look at the beach profiles, for example, or dune foot, etc., to look at a short to mid-term. But when looking at longer timescales, we're going to prefer to use some camera videos or lidars, which are laser that overlook the beach. They can be fixed or on drones. And here's an example. So you have 4 cameras overlooking the beach, and that's the type of images we can use at the end. And with that, we are able to look at the shoreline, the currents here, or in white you can see the sandbar. So that leads to the understanding of different parameters on the longer term scale. Finally, for very long time scales, we're going to use old photographs or old maps, aerial photographs, or even satellite images more and more, and they're covering a longer time scale but also a longer section of the beach or the coast. The second parameter which is interesting to look at when you look at the coastline, it's to understand the hydrodynamics that are modifying the coastline. So you have the observation, you have the morphology changing, but you need to understand why. And one of the parameters we look at is first of all the tide. Here is an example of a tidal gauge, or you can use a simple ruler that gives you the water level. And with the development of new technologies, now satellites are now allowed to, are now able to give you a good idea of the water level. We're also looking at the waves. So when it's possible, we're using wave buoys that are giving you a very accurate and precise measure of the waves. But when it's not possible, we use models. Here is just an example of the SWAT model that gives you the waves offshore and then gives you the propagation of the waves at the coast. And when it's possible, again, we develop field work. So it's basically 10 to 15 days when we can deploy different instruments that measure directly the waves, the currents, the sediment transport, etc. And the last thing that we can look at is the currents. And to look at the currents, there are two main things that we are using. The first one is the drifters. So it's something that is going to drift and follow the currents with the GPS at the top, and then you can see the road and that the drifters have taken. The other solution is to release some dye in one point and then to look at the dye moving, which is transported by the currents. So once you monitor the coast, what is the plan? What is the next step? The next step is to manage in order to protect the coast. And in the management, there are already solutions that has been deployed that goes from human-based solution to nature-based solution. And here I'm just going to present a few solutions that have been already deployed. It's just a few of them, few examples. It's not complete, but that's the main examples and the main protection that have been deployed for the past decades. The first one is going to be the main base solution. So if you look at those pictures, that's kind of what have been done for the past decades. It's called hard solutions, includes seawalls, dike, etc. You can see some dikes, offshore dikes, also geotextile, but those solutions are not sustainable solutions. They are usually deployed to react to one big emergency at some point. And here is a good example. You can see here the dikes are deployed and it's protecting one tiny part of the whole coastline, but increasing the erosion on the other parts, so it's not sustainable. Other soft solution, human-based solution, or the rescinding of the beach, but again, that's just for emergency, or the deployment of wave breakers or wind breakers to keep the sediment. But again, those are more emergency reaction than proaction. And to go towards something that is more sustainable, we look at nature-based solution. The only thing with nature-based solution is that it takes time to be completely effective. So one of the first things that is being deployed now, and people are working more and more on that, is to deploy underwater plants that will dissipate the energy of the waves and protect the coast. We also have those plants that are planted on the dune to keep the sediment. But another thing that has been deployed recently is to try to work on the tourism that is more green tourism, and to show that we don't have to destroy everything and destroy the coast to bring money to the city. Another thing about coastal management is now, like I said, we are trying to get more long-term and sustainable managed plans for the coast. And one of the examples is the project I'm working on at the minute, which is called Malcolm Project. And the purpose of the project is to develop tools and to monitor and manage marine protected areas, but in a sustainable way. Not to be an on reaction all the time, but to pro-react and to try to understand how everything works. And in this project, which is led by Northern Ireland and Scotland, the thing is we are not focused on just the ecosystems or the coastal processes. We're trying to overlook at all the interactions between all those different teams, because coastal processes is going to lead to the seabed habitats, and the habitats are going to influence on the mammals and the seabirds and all the sea life. So if I have a take-home message here is that the coastline are diverse and there are more and more at risk in the complex climate change context we are living in. There is a real emergency to better understand the coastal processes and everything that goes with. There is a need to develop the coastal monitoring, because the more we understand about the coastal processes, the more we are able to have accurate models, and the more we'll be able to predict and better protect our coastline. And that will have an impact not only on the environment but also on the humanity. And for me, at the minute, even if everything looks a bit complicated and complex, there is a real hope for the coasts, and there is a real hope in the development of sustainable solutions for the coastal management.
Hello, my name is Ryan McGeady and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the School of Geography and Environmental Sciences at Ulster University. Today I'm going to talk to you about some of the research that we've been conducting in Ulster University on the MARPAN project. Our research focuses on the seabed mapping and monitoring component of this project. The Marine Protected Areas Management and Monitoring Project, or MARPAM, is a multi-institution project involving approximately 50 individuals from 7 organisations. It aims to develop tools to monitor and manage protected coastal and marine environments in Ireland, Northern Ireland and Scotland. Our work in Ulster University on the seabed mapping and modelling aspect of MARPAN involves reviewing and trialling a number of novel non-destructive methods to monitor marine protected areas, and also mapping the distribution of the critically endangered common skate. This work will help us to conserve important seabed habitats and species and protect vital marine ecosystems. To start, our work in assessing different methods of monitoring the marine environment. With continuous advances in technology, there are an increasing number of options available to marine scientists interested in monitoring the seabed. Our research often involves going to sea for weeks at a time on large research vessels such as the Celtic Explorer operated by the Marine Institute and the Christie's operated by the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute in Northern Ireland. At Ulster University, we have the recently commissioned inshore research vessel Laconia that enables us to carry out coastal and marine multidisciplinary science. Some of the equipment we use to monitor marine protected areas include autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, shown on the bottom left. These are unmanned vehicles which travel through the water without the need to be controlled by a driver. The AUV is pre-programmed to follow a defined track and is recovered at a later time when it has completed its work. They can collect various data sources including imagery, oceanography and bathymetry data. Underwater TV uses a sled which is deployed to collect real-time video and imagery of the seabed. Here, underwater TV footage shows vast numbers of sand eel that we observed off the north coast of Ireland earlier this year. Underwater laser scanners can be used to map seabed habitats in ultra-high resolution and create 3D models of underwater environments. Lasers enable us to characterize small-scale features which would otherwise be missed using other methods. We've also used multi-beam echo sounders, which are a type of sonar that emits acoustic waves to map the seabed under the ship. On the bottom right, you will see deep sea mounds on Fangorn Bank mapped using the multi-beam echo sounder. Remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, are underwater vehicles which are tethered to the ship and controlled by operators aboard the vessel. In July of this year, we participated in a 3-week multidisciplinary research cruise on the Celtic Explorer. This survey involved deploying an ROV to explore the deep sea environment around Fangorn Bank, which is located 700 kilometres to the west of Ireland. The ROV was deployed to 1.5 kilometres depth to survey deep sea mounds and collect imagery and genetic samples of the seabed biodiversity in the area for the first time ever. Here you can see some of the diversity of life that we encountered, including sharks, bamboo coral that could be up to several hundred years old based on their size, and also on the bottom right, orange roughy, a deep sea fish which can live for over 200 years. Ocean floors are largely unexplored. More of the Moon and Mars have been mapped in high resolution compared to the bottom of the ocean. So the exploration of deep sea habitats is extremely important, as it can lead to the discovery of new species and habitats which help us to build a better understanding of the marine environment. Baited remote underwater video, or BRUVs for short, is a method of attracting communities of predators and scavengers and is used to monitor diversity, abundance, and behaviour of species. As a non-extractive technique, they have a very low environmental impact. The broad frame has a camera pointing at the bait canister and is illuminated by a light source. This is especially useful for deep environments and when working at night time. Here you can see some of the footage from numerous broad samples that we collected earlier this year, including dogfish, Norway lobster, and squid. This is a simple but effective method of monitoring the marine environment and is used to attract larger mobile species that would otherwise avoid alternative video systems. Next, our research into the common skate. The common skate is a large fish living on the seabed and is distributed from the Mediterranean Sea in the south to Iceland in the north. It was long thought to be a single species. However, in 2010, research discovered the fact that it in fact consists of two separate species which differ genetically and in their morphology. On the left, the flapper skate, and on the right, the blue skate. The flapper skate is one of the largest skate species in the world, growing to 2.5 meters, which is approximately the height from the floor to the ceiling in a typical house. The blue skate is also considered a large species, growing to 1.5 meters. As the name suggests, common skate were once very abundant across the northeast Atlantic. Overfishing, coupled with their long living, late maturing, and low fecundity characteristics, led to the collapse of populations during the 20th century. Today their numbers are a fraction of what was reported in the early 1900s, and they are now absent from areas such as the Irish Sea and southern North Sea. In 2009, a ban on landing common skate was introduced so that commercial fishers that caught the species in their nets had to release them back into the sea. This action was taken due to collapsing populations as the species complex was classified as critically endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. This critically endangered classification means that the species faces an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild. Our research at Ulster University involves mapping the distribution of the common skate using both historical data and new data collected using non-invasive baited remote underwater video as shown here. This research will help us to gain a better understanding of areas where skate are found in highest abundances so that they can be protected. We will also examine time series of common skate abundance to assess whether the landings ban has had the desired effect in protecting the species. This research will enhance efforts to conserve this charismatic megafauna and help to promote its recovery in the future. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to find out more about our research, please visit the MARPAM website at mpa-management.eu. You can also keep up to date with our work by following me on Twitter at McGeady-Ryan or at marpam_project. Thank you.
A massive thank you to Dr. Ryan McGeady and Dr. Melanie Biosk for the insights on the research, which has given us a lot to consider when thinking about rising sea levels and the impact of climate change. Thanks again to Dr. Asha de Vos for taking the time to be part of today's event, all the way from Sri Lanka. Thank you so much. And finally, thank you to all of you for joining this event with CADA, NI and Ulster University. It's clear that humans are causing a devastating impact on our oceans through global warming and pollution. We all must consider what we can do to reduce our impact on the environment and slow the rise of ocean levels, impacting life around the world. This year, One World Festival aims to bring people together online at a time we are still physically apart to engage with our diverse communities here in Northern Ireland, but also with people around the world. So please visit oneworldfestivalni.com to see what else is on this week, and check us out on social media using the hashtag #ActOneWorld. Thank you so much.
It was